commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Phil Twyford.
Mr Speaker, Labor will be supporting the Marine Legislation Bill to Select Committee. This is a bill, sir, an omnibus bill that amends the Maritime Transport Act of 1994, as Mr Williamson was just telling us, and the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Act from 2012, only recently passed into law, that particular bit of legislation, to enact various international conventions around maritime safety and ocean pollution. This is a bill, sir, that is worthy of support. It's a reasonable bill. It's drafted to include a number of measures to boost port and harbour safety and give a little more teeth to the voluntary New Zealand Port and Harbour Marine Safety Code. And I'll just mention some of those things. They're unremarkable but useful provisions. It will extend authority for a Maritime New Zealand Director to take action where port safety is a risk to the safety of shipping or the marine environment. Sounds reasonable enough. It places responsibility on port operators and regional councils to address maritime safety issues. Nothing to object to there. The Minister is given power to make rules to ensure port and ship traffic safety. The Local Government Act is amended to move some provisions into the Maritime Transport Act and allow local government to apply national maritime safety laws without creating bylaws. Regional councils will be required to appoint suitable harbour masters, as they should, who will, alongside enforcement officers, be able to issue infringement notices for breaches of maritime rules. It's an unobjectionable bill, Mr Speaker. It's just a little late. In fact, it's $50 million too late, Mr Speaker, because this national government is such a shambles, they couldn't get their act together to pass into law international conventions that would have saved the taxpayer $50 million. When this government came to office at the end of 2008, sir, the briefing to the incoming minister recommended that they implement and sign up to the International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Pollution Damage, otherwise known as the Bunker Oil Convention, and a number of changes to the Convention on Limitation of Liability for Maritime Claims. If they had done that, instead of shelving that important advice, the New Zealand taxpayer would not be left in the position of having to fork out the lion's share of $50 million to pay for the clean-up of the Rena grounding. So this government should be embarrassed today that this bill is a form of fronting up in this House to the New Zealand taxpayer for a massive waste of taxpayers' resources, because this government is such a shambles they weren't able to see the significance of implementing those recommendations from officials. And Stephen Joyce is on the record. He's acknowledged it. He said, sir, that unfortunately it wasn't made clear there would be the effect that it's obviously having in this case in terms of the level of potential liability. It's disappointing, he said, but you deal with the hand you're dealt with. Well, that minister, sir, was advised in the incoming briefing that this government should implement these conventions. The work was all done under the last Labor government. It was there on the desk of the new minister, but he couldn't see fit to implement those recommendations, and as a result, taxpayers are going to have to pay the cost of cleaning up the Rena grounding. There's another issue, sir, that jumps out from this bill that I think is worth commenting on in this first reading debate. Due to the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, 1978, the bill imposes an alcohol limit of 0.05 grams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood on masters, officers and other merchant seafarers performing safety, security and marine environmental duties. Now, why could the drafters of this bill, why could they have come up with this amount, 0.5 grams per alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood? I mean, it's interesting. It's possibly a completely arbitrary amount, 0.05. That's very interesting. So that's the same 0.05 millilitres that the government refused to legislate for people driving a motor vehicle. So it's okay for merchant seamen, seafarers, masters and officers to be held to that standard of alcohol consumption when they're in charge of a vessel on our coastline, but it's not okay to expect the same level of people who are in charge of a motor vehicle on our roads. Well, that is very interesting, sir. Exactly, Mr. Williams, it's the kind of double standard that we have come to expect from this government. What we know, sir, is that all the research, all the international best practice points to 0.05 millilitres as being the obvious, the obvious standard that's required of someone who's in charge of whether it's a motor vehicle or a ship on our coastline. It is the obvious standard that people should be held to. But what we know also is that the Minister of Transport pulled that provision, refused to support it, because he didn't like the optics. Because it might be seen to be a bit too nanny state for this national party, for this national government. And yet perfectly happy for merchant seamen and officers to be held to this standard, sir, and not allowed to have any more alcohol in their blood than 0.05 millilitres when they're in charge of a ship on our coastline. But apparently it's okay. It's okay, Mr. Bennett, for New Zealanders to drive a car when they've got that much alcohol in their bloodstream. Well, I'm sure we'll have some very interesting discussions at Select Committee about that. Apparently, about 80 vessels would be affected by this change, and the regulatory impact, sir, estimates there will be 10 incidents per year that could be affected or avoided because of this new provision. This compares with the 34% of fatal car accidents that are linked to alcohol, and what we know is that National will not, against all the good advice they've had, reduce the blood alcohol level for motorists to 0.05 millilitres. It's interesting, I think, also to note, sir, that the 0.05 level is already less restrictive than that faced by a number of vessels already operating on New Zealand's coastline. The two Cook Strait ferry operators have 0 alcohol limits, and Pacifica Shipping, which is the sort of last remnant of our coastal shipping service that's been destroyed by the policies of this national government, has a blood alcohol limit of 0.04 for its employees. So 0.05, it's not draconian, but it's too draconian for National to implement that limit in regards to motorists. The third point that I want to make, sir, is that there are numerous other Maritime Transport Act amendments in this bill, sir, that relate to the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Act. 37 pages of amendments to the EEZ legislation that this national government passed only a month ago. What kind of shambles is this, that they would bring 37 pages of amendments to this House a month after the EEZ legislation was pushed through this House? What an absolute embarrassment. These amendments raise the question, sir, of why the Minister for the Environment, Amy Adams, had to dump the substantive changes in her SOP on Parliament after the Select Committee, on the Select Committee, rather than including it in the bill. And it also goes some way to explaining, sir, why the EEZ legislation was rushed back from Select Committee, as the Maritime Legislation Bill must be passed this year if it's going to meet the January deadline that is set down in the conventions. So it's really a shambles, sir. Why this Parliament is being asked to process this many amendments only a month after National passed its EEZ bill. I think the members on that side of the House have some questions to answer.
Call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.